Hey, welcome everybody to the PodCouple virtual podcast. This is Tom Suozzi. I'm the Democratic co-chair of the Problem Solvers Caucus. And Brian?
Hey, everyone. Brian Fitzpatrick, Pennsylvania's 1st District.
So the Problem Solvers Caucus is 46 members of Congress, 23 Democrats, 23 Republicans, trying to find common ground in this very, very divided, toxic environment that we find in Washington, D.C. And one of the things that we've highlighted as a central problem facing our country right now is affordability. And we've invited two economists to come and speak with us today about the affordability crisis that we're facing in our country as the problem solvers try to find a way forward with our affordability agenda. So we brought someone from the formerly from the Trump administration, Mike Faulkender. Did I say that right, Mike?
Yes, you did, sir.
Mike Faulkender, the former U.S. Deputy Secretary of the Treasury under the Trump administration, and also Aaron Klein, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Economic Policy for the U.S. Treasury for the Obama administration. And so we'd like to talk with you guys to try and get a better understanding from your differing perspectives and see where we can find common ground about what's happening. Why are we having an affordability crisis in America today? What are the main drivers that are causing the problems that we're facing with people not being able to afford their cost of living? And before we open it up to Mike and Aaron, let me see if Brian wants to add something to our introduction.
Yeah, so, Tom and I have forged together, as has our entire group, to really do our part to zoom and focus on this. One of the things that frustrates and has frustrated people in our country for a long period of time, that we see administration after administration sort of losing touch with the electorate. Tom and I are from the people's house. We are the closest to the people. We have the smallest districts. We're on the ballot the most frequently every 2 years. That's why it's called the people's house. And I think the reason why our founders in their brilliance created the system the way it is, with the two chambers, with the differing jurisdictions and time periods, is to make sure that we have one body that is the closest to the people, and that is us. And on top of that, our group, the problem solvers, we feel is especially the most close to the electorate, because we all operate in the center the same way people function in their everyday lives, the same way they function in their relationships. So we felt it was incumbent upon us and our group in our chamber at this time to zoom in on the issue of affordability, not just at a 30,000-foot level, but to drill down into the individual silos of childcare, healthcare, college tuition, food, fuel, housing, all the issues and all the budgetary strains that are being placed on people's budgets, and talk about what we can do. Number one, what are the cost drivers? And number two, what can be done on the federal legislative level? What can be done on the state legislative level? What is entirely a matter of private sector policy? What's the administration's capability of addressing it? So that's really what we wanted to bring you two gentlemen on for. And with that, we can start with Mike and then Aaron, just to give your general thoughts.
Sure. So thanks for having me on. It's great to be with you both. And I'm entirely in agreement with you that affordability is one of the biggest issues for the American people today. When I was being brought on to the administration, I served as the chief economist at Treasury in the first term, as the assistant secretary for economic policy. And then the second term last year, I served as the deputy secretary. And we came into office thinking that the best way for us to address affordability is to increase the supply of various, products and services that the American people are reliant upon. And so let me start in housing. I think that one of the most important things we need to do is find ways to increase the quantity of housing being generated. So how do we bring more land into availability? How do we work with states and municipalities to improve their building codes, to improve their zoning laws? And how do we use federal dollars as incentives to get states and municipalities to make it easier to engage in new home construction? We have not seen the types of productivity improvements in housing that we have seen in a number of other areas. And it's because we still operate on a decades old model of building every part of the house on site. Imagine if for a moment you could mass produce wall units in factories and then bring them to job sites and literally put them together like Lego pieces on job sites. And yet a lot of what keeps us from doing that is that local building codes and inspection regimes don't facilitate reciprocity of inspections of plumbing and electrical, and almost necessitate building on site. So there are ways that we can improve housing affordability, but of course, the number one thing to do to improve housing affordability is to bring down interest rates. And the way to do that is to tackle our long-term budget deficits so that interest rates will come down for treasuries, and that will then bring down interest rates on every derivative interest rate product like mortgages. When it comes to things like food, one of the big inputs we have in food prices are energy, water, and fertilizer. And so how do we increase the production of various sources of energy? I have long been an advocate of an all of the above energy strategy, because we cannot be solely reliant on intermittent high cost sources of power. We need to provide all sources of power and let local jurisdictions figure out the economics that make sense for them. As I just indicated, energy is the base of generating affordability, because energy prices go into the production of every other product. And so bringing down the cost of production, the cost of transportation, by greatly increasing domestic sources of energy, I think is at the heart of what we were trying to do when the president came back into office. I'll stop there and let Aaron chime in, but obviously there are a number of other sectors, but housing, food, and energy, I think, are the key to generating improvement in affordability across our great land.
Yeah, let me echo. There's a lot of that Mike and I agree with. First of all, on housing, it's absolutely true that that's the number one driver. The CPI, what we use to measure inflation, more than a third of it is housing. And one of the things that you can do to decrease the cost of housing is to build more houses. And unfortunately, what I've seen across the country and in my little neighborhood in Maryland, where I live, where I grew up, my daughter's in the same middle school I went to in Tacoma Park, Maryland, and they wanted to build a bunch of houses right on top of their metro station, and all the environmental groups, wrap themselves around 3 trees there, and basically, bastardize the environmental review process to hold up building new homes, because we have a requirement in my county that 15 to 20% of new homes be affordable. When you build an apartment building, you have to set some aside so that people of all income, and they didn't want new people. And these are, the most quote unquote liberal people you could imagine, were saving the trees at a cost of moving people to live. And there's a huge domino effect. If you can't live by a subway, then you have to live somewhere that's affordable, but now you have to own a car, which is very expensive, and move the car and drive that around. And is that really good for the environment? So tackling housing supply, changing environmental rules, changing reformation, changing local land use. Also, I think there's a bunch of back office financing. The government has done something to make 1 to 4 unit housing very affordable. It's called single family housing. And then you get these big 250 giant properties, often called Class A. But between 5 and 49, what made up the neighborhood in Queens where my mom grew up in, much more 10, 12 story, 12 unit buildings is very difficult to finance, in part because the government is subsidizing one side and not the other. I have a paper out with a colleague at Wharton, Chris Hughes, talking about using this obscure thing called the Federal Home Loan Bank system to provide more financing to build these 5 to 49 unit buildings, some of which you can go to by right. The federal government can't go in and rezone your counties. But what they can do is provide financing for a 5 or 8 unit building, because once you get past 4 units, you don't qualify anymore for a lot of existing federal programs. So those are a couple big things. The second thing I want to mention here is energy. The Obama administration also pursued an all of the above energy strategy. We put in seed investments for companies like Tesla. Now that program got vilified because it also funded some companies that didn't work, like Solyndra. But in point of fact, if you'd been a venture capitalist and taken equity stakes, something that I think is very interesting that this administration is doing, you'd be rich beyond Croesus, because we helped save Tesla, which that type of investment in technology creates more affordable energy down the road. And I get nervous when we're cutting our science and research investment funding. So I think folks in Congress, I know you want quick answers. You're on the ballot every 2 years. But, if you think about the different ways that solar and renewable have developed and allowed for more energy production in the United States, that's very, very, very wise. So I think that's a couple things. The last thing I do to tackle the affordability crisis is help wages. What's affordable is a function of how much money you have. We haven't raised the minimum wage in this country in almost 20 years. It's now the lowest rate it's ever been when adjusted for inflation. And let's try to figure out ways to put more money in workers' pockets. I have some other ideas about how to save people money in things that cost too much now, and that'll make the rest of life a little more affordable.
The minimum wage is $7.25 an hour in 22 states. If you make $10 an hour and you work 40 hours a week and you work 50 weeks a year, that's $20,000 a year. $15 an hour, that's $30,000 a year. $20 an hour, that's $40,000 a year. It's not easy to buy a house, educate your kids, pay for health insurance, and retire on $20,000 or $30,000 in America these days. So, Michael, you pointed out, how the debt that we have overhanging everything is causing upward pressure on interest rates. And I think that that's something that Brian and I have been talking about this big debt crisis we have in the country, and the upward pressure it causes on interest rates makes it more difficult to buy a home or lease a car or even borrow money for your business. But what about other things that are in the news these days, like tariffs and the war? How are those things affecting prices and affordability? Why don't you go first, Michael?
Sure. So you're right that if you look at the increase in gas prices since the conflict in Iran has started, that we've had a significant rise in gas prices. They're up about 50% over where they were about a year ago. Provided that the president actually brings that to a resolution shortly, the financial markets seem to be suggesting that we'll get oil prices back down, and that'll bring gas prices down with it. So it is a case that while this conflict is going on, we've got a temporarily elevated price of gasoline and oil energy prices in general. That is entirely solvable by resolving the conflict in the Middle East. In terms of tariffs, I am of the view that we had some long-standing trade imbalances. The Secretary Bessent has talked about China having the most unbalanced economy in global history, and that we see the Chinese engaging in, whether it's unlawful subsidies, whether it's intellectual property theft, whether it's currency manipulation. I am of the view that tariffs are an appropriate tool for us to address these imbalances and to address some of the national security impact that it has, because what the consolidation of a number of critical industries in China has done is make us vulnerable on things like critical minerals, on magnets, on pharmaceuticals that can be leveraged for geopolitical purposes. I am of the view that I recognize that is, if we then tariff those activities in order to create an economic environment that is competitive for U.S. companies and companies in allied nations to then come into it, it's going to potentially be more expensive than if we continue to get those products from China. But the alternative is to allow China to have this national security advantage that I don't think is good for anybody in this country. So re-domesticating some of our manufacturing base is going to be an investment that the government and that the American people are going to have to incur. But I think that is well worth it. I think that, and I don't think that has contributed all that much to the housing problem. Again, just to reiterate something Aaron said, a generation or two ago, the first-time home buyer averaged 26 years old. Today, it's 40. And so really tackling how do we increase the supply of houses and how do we bring down mortgage rates, I don't think has a tariff component to it. I think it's much more what is the cost of capital in financial markets, and how do we make it cheaper for us to engage in new construction.
So Michael, I'm gonna agree with you and think that we do have to hold China accountable, and tariffs is a good vehicle by which to hold them accountable. But we have tariffs in a lot of countries throughout the world right now, not just China. And I'm concerned about the tariffs on a more broad base and how it's affecting things. But I'd like to hear what Aaron has to say about tariffs and the war and how it's affecting prices.
Yeah, so Carson, Susie, I was going to jump in and say the same thing. When I was actually working in the United States Senate Banking Committee as the chief economist, we had a bipartisan bill passed through the committee to hold China more accountable for their currency manipulation, and we were beat back by then the Bush administration. And sadly, when I was in the Obama administration, we didn't pivot to address the Chinese currency manipulation. And if we're not careful, we got to be concerned about these Chinese electric cars that are out there at $25,000 that are taking up market share all over Europe and all over the rest of the world. And we seem to think we can just ban these things and they won't find their way into the US. I'm not so sure about that, but I do think we needed a different approach as it related to China. But per your comment, taxing Canadian lumber is going to affect the cost of getting wood. And it's not clear to me that Canada was gaming us on currency manipulation or other things. Why we've picked fights with some of our allies. In addition to the tariffs, there's a question of certainty and uncertainty. You can move the financial markets by threatening to do something and then not following through, and then threatening and then following through, and then rolling back, and markets will whipsaw all around. But if you're a business person, uncertainty just makes you wait. It just slows investment, delays growth. And, if I were to ask you what's going to be the tariff rate on China, on Canada, on Europe, on Mexico, 6 months from now, a year from now, who knows? And that type of uncertainty is problematic. As it relates to the war, the gas price issue is real. Gas is, when you talk about affordability, I think economists use this term elasticity, which is basically how easy is it for you to not do something. So if going out to dinner becomes more expensive, you can eat home more. But driving is something that's harder to curb, particularly in the short term. You got to drive to work. I got to drive my kids to soccer practice, right? Like you got different things you have to do. And so that's an inelastic good. So what happens when the price of gas goes up is people in the short run are buying the same amount of gas, same car, same amount of driving generally. And so then something else has to give. And it's that something else that then has knock-on effects within the economy because you don't go out to dinner, you don't do, take a, summer road trip. I think we're going to see some real differences in summer vacation travel. And that's going to have some real spill on and knock-on effects.
Yeah. So on the affordability, broadly, we've talked a lot about this in our caucus meetings. And correct us if we're wrong, but we really put it into three separate buckets. This issue of affordability. Number one, our wages, which one of you touched upon. The second is the cost of goods and services. And lastly is what side of the debt curve are you on? Are you an investor where compound interest is working in your favor? Or are you operating in net deficits where your compound interest on your credit card bill is working against you and you're just fighting to pay off your credit card bill minimum payment, pay off your student loan interest? That's also a big driver. But on the topic, just one response to Mike and then to Aaron. Mike, on the issue of tariffs and the Iran war, I think question one is the policy, right? And we can have a discussion about what the right policy is. The second question, and a big one for us, is who decides, right? So on the question of tariffs, I sit on the Ways and Means Committee. Tom sits on the Ways and Means Committee. Tom and I come from different parties, but when the tariff vote came to the floor, and only one came to the floor, Tom and I both voted the same way, even though we may have different perspectives on what is just and right in terms of tariff policy. The Ways and Means Committee in Congress really is supposed to be the one deciding that. On the question of the Iran war. As soon as we pass the 60-day mark, the War Powers Act of 73, which is the law of the land, says that after 60 days, that has to come to Congress. Tom and I voted the same way on that, even though we may have different perspectives on policy towards Iran. And then to Aaron, on the minimum wage, we had, and Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you were still in Congress at the time, when the minimum wage vote came up, and I voted for it, $15 minimum wage, even though I think the better policy, quite frankly, is to have a livable wage policy rather than minimum. $15 an hour in Birmingham is not the same as $15 an hour in Brooklyn. So I think the better conversation to have in the context of affordability is a livable wage based on cost of living, based on region, based on family circumstance, is the more intellectually honest way to go there.
No, I don't think we have a lot of time left. So let's just ask you quickly, if we had to wave a magic wand and try and get something done to reduce cost of living for the American people, what would each of you suggest? I'll let Aaron go first and let Mike close it out.
Yeah, so there's an existing law that requires the Federal Reserve to give people access to their money as fast as technology allows. Yet here we are on the Tuesday recording this, and if I deposited my paycheck on Friday, I still wouldn't have it in my bank account. Even how do we live in a world where Amazon can get anything in the world to your door faster than your own check can clear? The reality is the Federal Reserve isn't following the law. Now you say, so what? Well, $35 billion a year is spent in overdraft fees by people who've run out of money. About half of those, according to my research, are people just waiting for their check to clear or would be solved in 2 days faster access to their money. 70% of people who go to check cashers have a bank account. Why are you at a check casher? Why aren't you at your bank? Your bank's free. Check casher gives you your money immediately. What am I supposed to do over the weekend? So if I can wave a magic wand, I would force the Fed to follow the law or pass the law and just say your money has to be there within 30 minutes of how you deposit it. The technology has been there. The rest of the world has real-time payments. You guys have probably traveled the world a little bit. You go anywhere else in the world, your money's there immediately. Only in the US do banks get to sit on it, make fortunes sitting on it, because they have a captive regulator who, frankly, doesn't really follow the law.
Okay, Mike.
Very quickly, I would do something about nuclear power in this country. I think that small modular reactors and having a uniform license for manufacturing them and getting them out there to power data centers is a no-brainer. I think fixing environmental regulation so that irrespective of what you think the source of power should be, we can update our transmission lines and make it easier to get pipelines built, because at the end of the day, pipelines are the safest way to send natural gas anywhere. I think that updating local regulation on zoning and construction and permitting costs and having federal incentives to do so is absolutely essential. I think that making sure we have a regulatory environment that harnesses productivity improvements like artificial intelligence, because ultimately the way that you raise wages is not by constraining labor through things like the minimum wage. Instead, it is by giving people the tools in order to make their labor more productive and thereby command higher wages. And so in decreasing the regulation and providing regulatory certainty as to how to unleash artificial intelligence, those are the 4 areas where I would start.
Okay, great. Well, listen, I wish we could spend a lot more time with you guys, but that's going to have to wrap up the Pod Couple virtual podcast for today. We're going to agree with you. We're working very hard on permitting reform. I think both of you think that's an important thing for us to do. Well, Brian and I certainly agree that when it comes to tariff policy, we should be bringing it before the Ways and Means Committee and debating it and figuring out what the best thing to do is to hold our adversaries accountable, to protect important national security and economic security issues, but also making sure we keep our markets open and moving and treat our friends a little bit better than we treat our adversaries. And
Mike and Aaron, we would love to bring you in before our full caucus meeting to talk about affordability and share some of your wisdom with us.
Love to do it. See you in person.
Thanks for having me with you. Great to see you, and I hope to do so again.
Thanks so much. Thank you for listening to The Pod Couple. We will be releasing new episodes regularly. You can watch and listen on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. If you have questions or ideas for the problem solvers to tackle, please contact us at problemsolvers@mail.house.gov.